Good evening, everyone. I'm Stefano Siglienti, and I'm the president of the Stanford Italian Alumni Chapter. I'm welcoming all of you, many with a Stanford affiliation, but also alums from other schools and friends of Stanford. Today, we're very excited to bring you yet another outstanding speaker, a Stanford University graduate, Nirav Tolia, who will talk to us about two valleys. One, of course, is the Silicon Valley, where Nirav studied and founded many successful ventures. And the other one is a less obvious one, is the valley where Firenze is located and where he now lives with his family. Let me first briefly introduce Nirav. He graduated from Stanford with a BA in English. And then he joined Yahoo as one of the first surfers, an employee number 84, back in 96, I guess. In 1999, which is, by the way, the year I graduated from business school, Nirav started Opinions, one of the first review sites, and navigated through the booms and busts of that era in the Silicon Valley to create shopping.com, where he was CEO and then instrumental to taking it public, and later being acquired by eBay for a hefty sum of about $620 million. He was then entrepreneur in residence at Benchmark Capital, a very renowned venture capital firm in the Silicon Valley, and before going on to start Nextdoor, the world's largest local social network, available in many countries around the world. And as CEO from 2010 to 2018, he helped raise $275 million for the company and grew it to a valuation of about 1.5 billion. Then, Nirav, you moved to Florence to teach a class in 2019. And tell us a bit about why you moved to Florence and how did that happen?
Well, first of all, Stefano, grazie mille for having me. Un grande onore essere qui con voi. It's a great honor to be with all of you and doing this this virtual presentation or fireside chat. And it's really nice to see some familiar faces and names among the attendees. So thank you all for coming. And I hope that over the next hour, we can have some good conversation and that you enjoy the session. To answer Stefano's question, there are three very important people in my life that influenced me in such a positive way that ultimately my wife and three young children decided to move to Florence for a kind of bella sabbatica, a great kind of family adventure. And so I'll tell you the story because I think it will probably in some ways provide some context, not just for why we're living in Italy, but also the subject at hand. So the first and someone who is another Stanford alum, much more successful than most, certainly more successful than me, someone that I look up to a great deal, a gentleman named Richard Barton. You may have heard his name. Besides being a Stanford grad and someone who actually studied at Stanford in Florence, he is a fantastic high-tech entrepreneur. He founded Expedia, which he ran as CEO, took public, and then ultimately sold for $10 billion. And then more recently, he has founded a company called Zillow, which is all about real estate, which is a public company as well that he's taken public as CEO. And it's got a market cap of north of $30 billion. So he's one of the few people in the world who started multiple technology companies, taken them public, multi-billion-dollar valuations. I mean, it doesn't get much better than Rich Barton. After he sold Expedia, he decided to do something pretty interesting, which is take a little bit of time off. Starting these companies and building them, it's very difficult. And if you spend 10 years doing it, it's like dog years. It's like 50, 60, or 70 years of normal activity. And so when he decided to take some time off, he had this amazing idea of coming back to Florence, where, as I mentioned, he'd studied at Stanford in Florence. And his wife and his three kids, similar to me with my wife and three kids, came and had a magical, I think, 15, 16 months in Florence. And Rich is someone that I've looked up to for a long time, and I was lucky enough to have him on my board at Nextdoor. And so as I was telling him that after 10 years of starting and running Nextdoor, I decided to move on and focus on my family and and get with my wife and be a co-founder in what we believed was the most important startup of them all, which is the startup of our children. He said, you know, if you want to do something really crazy, don't just go live someplace else for the summer, which had been our plan. Put your kids in an Italian school or go and live actually in a city for an entire school year. And so that was sort of the first time that my wife and I thought that we would move away from San Francisco and Silicon Valley, which in many ways felt like the center of the universe, and live not just somewhere different, but in a different country altogether. And that brings me to the second person who is hugely influential in this decision and someone that I also think extremely highly of. She happens to be on this call. That's Ermelinda Campani, who is the director of the Stanford and Florence Program. And we met for the first time through an introduction by Rich in February of 2019. So coming, I guess now 2 years ago. And we had a wonderful connection almost immediately. She probably would say that she had more of a connection with my wife, which most people do. So whenever I go anywhere, I try to bring my wife with me because she makes me look good. But Linda and I also enjoyed talking. And she was the first academic and I would say probably the first person in a more scholarly context that I expressed this hypothesis I had, which is that Silicon Valley today feels like what I imagine it felt like to live in Renaissance Florence. And I'm no expert in Renaissance Florence. She is much more so than me. And we got into this very interesting discussion, me talking more about Silicon Valley, her talking a little bit more about Renaissance Florence. And we connected and we both felt that there was a lot of merit in not just making the comparison, but having the conversation. As I used to tell the students, one can disagree that this comparison is valid, but it's an interesting conversation to have, and it's an interesting topic to explore. And so our first conversation, Linda and I, ultimately led to this incredible privilege and honor, which was to come and be a visiting lecturer at Stanford and Florence and try to develop this hypothesis into a class and engage students and see what they had to say about this comparison. Of course, Stanford students live in Silicon Valley, and they were choosing to come over and study in Florence, the seat of the Renaissance. And I think the larger conversation was really about, okay, forget Silicon Valley today or even Renaissance Florence 500 years ago. How do we as humankind create centers of genius? How do we create places where people are compelled and inspired to create greatness that ultimately the whole world can benefit from? And that was an unbelievable experience that I had starting in September of 2019, teaching the Stanford students and really exploring this topic at length. That brings me to the last really influential person, an Italian who gave my wife and I the courage to come over and live in Italy. And that is this third incredible role model of ours, a gentleman named Brunello Cuccinelli. Most of you who are Italian will know Brunello's name. Probably the worldwide people know him as the King of Kashmir. But he has become to me a kind of role model and someone who's keenly interested in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley has an interest in him because he has a set of philosophies that go far beyond Kashmir and retail and luxury, which are his industries, but more into what he calls a kind of humanism around capitalism. So how can you run a company to benefit not just your shareholders, but the world at large? And this was a conversation that Brunello and I had back in Silicon Valley, starting in 2018, which continued over subsequent years. And Brunello told me that it would be a wonderful experience and opportunity to come over and spend a year in Italy, not just for my wife and I, but for my young children, my 3 boys, ages now 8, 7, and 5, to try to create young Renaissance men of them in some way. And I see that there are folks on the call who know my children, have seen them, and they may not agree that they are young Renaissance men, but they are young Renaissance men in training. And so we came over in August of 2019 with the intent of spending a year in Florence. We had 7 absolutely magical months, could not have asked for more. And then, of course, about a year ago, coronavirus hit, and it hit Italy hard. At that point, we made a very difficult decision in literally a 24-hour span to go back to San Francisco, where we spent the subsequent 6 months. Interestingly, we left on March 1st. Florence and most of Italy shut down, I think, around March 7th, almost exactly a year ago. And then San Francisco shut down soon thereafter. So at that point, it didn't really matter that we were back home. We were living the same kind of existence that many people around the world were living. After spending 6 months in San Francisco, we realized that we'd never really been reintegrated into San Francisco life. And we were missing Italy, and our kids were missing Italy. So we decided to come back and try to do another year so that we could finish our adventure. And so we returned to Florence late August of 2020. Of course, things are different now, and were different when we came back. Unfortunately, Stanford and Florence has never opened since closing back in March of 2020. We had a couple of great months in Florence, and then, of course, the zones started, and we went from white zone to yellow zone to now orange zone, and hopefully we're going to fight off red zone. But it's still been an amazing experience for my wife, who's now speaking fluent Italian. Ho bisogno di studiare, so I still have some work to do to catch up to her. And for the children, it has just been the most amazing experience, living in a different country, but a country as rich with tradition and as rich today in its love of children as Italy, this amazing country that we're lucky to call a kind of second home. So I hope that wasn't too long an answer, but I wanted to give credit to Rich and Linda and Brunello as the real guiding lights to get us over here.
Thank you so much, Nirav. Yeah, thank you, Nirav. I think it was just so nice to hear from you, and the love that you have for Italy, which is sometimes more than us Italians have for our own country. That's also a very interesting discussion topic, maybe for later. Now, in your you already mentioned in your introduction, but you formalize in your course that there are 5 factors that you think are some 5 ingredients that are required to create an environment where creativity and genius can flourish. Where the Sistine Chapel is conceived and then painted, or where Leonardo can think about flying, or in modern terms, where innovation can happen at an ever-increasing pace. These are infrastructure, number 1, capital, of course, talent, and then you already mentioned in your introduction, humanism and community. What are the links between all these 5 factors, ingredients, and especially what is the recipe?
You know, it's funny that you use the word link, because the thing that I learned in doing my research, not just in better understanding the history of Silicon Valley, but in trying to go deep and understand the Renaissance, is that it's not just one thing that makes these places amazing. It's a series of things, and it's not just that series, it's that series coming together and working in connection with each other. So to say that they're links of a chain, or to say that they are all part of the same process, is essential in understanding how you create this center of genius. And I would say, to take a step back, the broader question is, how do we create environments where creativity, innovation, and I don't really love this word, but I'll use it, genius, where those things flourish, whether it's a region of the world, whether it's a company, whether it's an industry, whether it's a family. It's a kind of conversation that even my wife and I have. And ultimately, what we realized, and what I enjoyed speaking to the students about, were not only how do you bring these ingredients to one place, but how do you get them to start to work together? What is the interplay? I remember Linda and I talking about the interplay between these things. Infrastructure and capital, those 2 independently can be brought to the table, but how can one build the other? Humanism is this extremely interesting kind of evolution of thought that occurs during the Renaissance, where we shift from a God-centric view to more of a human-centric view. And it felt so resonant to me in Silicon Valley when people talk about any person who has a great idea and has the capacity to work very hard to make that idea come to fruition can change the world. This is a kind of expression that we use in Silicon Valley, change the world. And that's a kind of humanism. And so these things start to work together. I mean, the class was quite interesting because there were students who would come to me and say, you know, I don't believe that capitalism was one of the factors. And we would have this interesting discussion. I had other students who would come and say, I really believe the most important thing was talent. Without talent, none of these other things matter. Now, of course, we don't know. If it were easy to know, if it were, as you mentioned, a recipe that was in a cookbook, well, then there would be many more places like Silicon Valley and Renaissance Florence throughout history. But somehow these things come together, they build on each other, and then they create something that is a collective whole. And it's a little bit like a kind of flywheel spinning. The flywheel, and we talk about this a lot in Silicon Valley because many companies, it feels like there is no progress being made for so long. And then all of a sudden, as if a light bulb were turned on, it seems like this company is reaching escape velocity. In reality, the effort is linear. The output is actually nonlinear. And so if you're thinking about this metaphor of a flywheel is this round thing that you can tug on and you can pull on and you can push with all of your energy. And it seems like it's not even moving, but you keep doing it, you keep doing it, you keep doing it. Finally, you get a little bit of movement. And then you push harder and you get a little more movement. And before you know it, this flywheel is spinning with its own momentum. And so for you to make it go faster, you don't have to push it even as hard as you did to get it started. And in some way, that is what these factors do. Of course, you need talent. But when you bring talent to the table and you have a kind of mission mindset, and I use humanism as the example of the mission mindset, well, then it takes that talent to the next level. When you bring in capital, in the case of Renaissance Florence, it was the Medici family and other patrons. If you think about the venture capitalist and now the public market in Silicon Valley, it adds fuel to this fire. And this flywheel starts to spin faster and faster and faster and faster. And the faster it spins, the more incredible are the things that spin off of the flywheel. And in some ways, the faster it spins, the harder it is for any other area to catch up. And so this was a very interesting discussion that we would have really every single week. And it was based around, okay, are these the factors? If they're not the factors, what are the ones that we're missing? How do you recreate these things? Can you recreate them? And then finally, probably in some ways the most provocative, can we really make the case that the same factors that existed during the Renaissance are the factors that make Silicon Valley important? And that was something that from the beginning, I felt very strongly that the answer was yes. And I really enjoyed the conversations with the students because some of them agreed and many of them didn't.
So I'm curious, those ones who didn't, what they were saying. But a couple of points that you touched upon and maybe are worth delving in is one of the by reading your syllabus, I was caught up by this Walter Isaacson mentioning and saying that creative genius are those that are curious among many different disciplines, and usually they're not just curious about algorithms and coding. Actually, they are curious about arts and font types, like Steve Jobs. There's, he quoted a very famous Apple TV ad saying that they're misfits and rebels. They are the troublemakers. They're the crazy one that are crazy enough to think that they can change the world. Now, do you really need to be that crazy to be innovative and genius?
You know, that there's a lot in what you just said to unpack. Let's get to the crazy ones in a moment, but I want to start by hitting on something that you started with, which is this idea of being broad. and having an exposure or an expertise in different disciplines. And this is really important because in this current tech boom, it's easy for us to forget about the liberal arts. It's easy for us to forget about philosophy and literature and humanism and all of these things that maybe we once studied, but now we say, look, if you can write code, none of that other stuff really matters. Well, Steve Jobs was very famous for saying that Apple as a company sits at the intersection of liberal arts and technology. And I think that was a very straightforward way of saying that there is tremendous benefit in being able to absorb multiple disciplines and then understand where the connections are between those disciplines. I had this uniquely Florence moment on Friday. It was my 10-year wedding anniversary. And my wife planned this incredible surprise, which is we went to one of the most beautiful churches in Florence, San Miniato, which is up high. And of course, it's very difficult to get into these churches except for during service. They're not open during the day. And we're very lucky because we've been able to meet Padre Bernardo, the priest there. And so he let us in, and my wife had translated our wedding vows into Italian, and we renewed our vows in Italian in front of Padre Bernardo, and he sort of blessed us. So it was sort of an only in Florence kind of moment. Unfortunately, you can't do anything like that in Silicon Valley. But the reason I bring it up is San Miniato, if you have been there or if you haven't heard of the church, is quite interesting because it is, in a way, a fusion of faith and science. Now, you might be wondering, okay, he's talking about a church. What has to do with science when it comes to a church? Well, it was built in such a way that many of the angles, many of the structures, many of the rules that went into creating this church are mathematical in nature. And they did very interesting things, like they have windows at certain places where when the sunlight filters in, it hits the ground, where there is both an astrological clock and an Arabic numeral clock. And so they could tell the time based on the movement of the sun and the stars. And so that place has always been really interesting for me because it's obviously a symbol of religion. It's a very, very old church. So it's a symbol of so much of what makes Italy an incredible country with its rich history. But it's also quite modern in its way. It's also something that feels contemporary, even as old as the edifice is. And Padre Bernardo, if you're in Florence and you have a chance to go and visit this church, he's also what I would describe as very progressive and contemporary, yet steeped in the tradition that, of course, I think he's a Benedictine monk. And so he's very steeped in tradition, but also quite contemporary. And so this idea that we can bring the best ideas from multiple disciplines together to create these incredible innovation, I think that's a really, really important point. It's too easy to say either, I'm not technical, I don't understand what those geeks do, they're writing code, they don't really want to talk to each other, everything's done virtually over Zoom. And it's too easy to say, well, if you're reading a book these days, you're wasting time. If you're studying literature these days, you're wasting time. In fact, many of the sharpest thinkers in Silicon Valley, they use this expression, far illusions, not illusions, but allusions, ALLUSSION. And what they're saying is many of the most innovative ideas have to anticipate the future. It's not enough to know what's going to happen tomorrow. You have to predict what will happen 5 years, 10 years, 50 years from now. And in many cases, the people who do that best are able to do so because they bring together something they've read in historic literature with something they've studied in terms of the future of technology or the future of economics or the future of something that's happening that we can't even really conceptualize of because it hasn't happened yet. And so the merging of those disciplines is, I think, very, very, very important. I was so impressed that Stanford students would be interested in coming to study in Florence, because the majority of Stanford students these days, I think the most popular major is computer science. They might say to themselves, I'm in the renaissance of computer science being in Silicon Valley. Why would I need to come to the old world? Why would I need to come to Florence? And I was very, very, very impressed when these computer scientists, because even in my class, the 18 or 20 students that I had, the majority of them were techies, as we used to say at Stanford. They're fuzzies and techies. And back when I was at Stanford studying to be a pre-med, I wanted to make my parents proud and be a doctor. You know, I would never have been able to justify coming to Florence to study. That would have felt like a vacation, not like some pre-med class that I was taking, like organic chemistry, that I hated or something like that. But these guys came over because they wanted to understand, okay, if we build technology companies, what will be the impact on the world? They may not have been able to articulate this idea of humanism or responsibility, but that's what they felt. And so anyway, that's the first point. The second point about being crazy, I think to some extent, you do have to be a little crazy to do things that are so different than everything else you see around you. I didn't realize it as much until I was a parent. And as a parent, you're always looking at your children and saying, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. You want them to sort of be in this really well-defined lane, and you know they have to act the right way, and they need to do what's socially acceptable. And I wonder sometimes, are we in some ways pushing down the creativity that our children have because we are over-programming them? We're kind of expecting things of them that are just within the lines. In Silicon Valley, it's interesting because as long as you can justify your crazy idea with very hard work and some traction, some output, some proof of concept, and then eventually a product itself, you can have wide acceptance regardless of what your ideas are. I get the sense that in many cases in Renaissance Florence, it was about pushing the envelope. And to do that, I think you need one ingredient that you mentioned as one of the five, that for me is the most important ingredient. And ultimately, it's the one that the students wanted to talk about the most, and that is community. It's this idea that creativity can flourish inside each of us, but what really helps it come out of us, and what helps it come out of us and then manifest into something tangible, is having other people like us around, having people that can inspire us, having people who can lift us up, who can work on something together. And so while I agree that there are misfits and crazy folks, and I'm sure they look that way in Renaissance Florence. I mean, recently my wife and I talked about rereading Agony and the Agony and the Ecstasy, which is a book on Michelangelo, because living in Florence and reading that book is really special because you get to sort of walk the streets that you're reading about. And in that book, I remember thinking, wow, he had a pretty tough life. It wasn't just all flowers and roses, and you know he's this genius sculptor. The same goes with Da Vinci's life, and I think that you know we see in similar ways that the toll it takes in Silicon Valley to create these kinds of companies, it's immense. And the thing that makes it worthwhile is, number one, feeling like you're actually making a dent in the universe. That's Steve Jobs' expression, make a dent in the universe. And the other thing that makes it worthwhile is doing it with other people. Because when you're doing it with other people, your teammates, your colleagues, whether it's your family or your coworkers or your friends, or any kind of affinity group that you come together in a kind of community with, the highs feel much, much, much higher, and the lows feel not quite so low. So for me, community is the single most important kind of factor. And I think we'll probably touch on this at the end. I wonder, in this new world where we've all become so comfortable retreating inside our own cocoons, and in most cases by necessity versus because we've chosen it, and where we're now doing things like this over Zoom, creating community over Zoom, even doing it this way, which is better than nothing, I can't see the faces of everyone that's listening. And there's something that's missing. There's some bit of the community that we're creating in this session that's missing because of that. And I wonder now what will happen in the world if our communities are much, much, much smaller. I think we'd all probably agree that there's some good that's come out of that. Instead of going outside the home, we're back inside, and we're really cherishing that. But I think we also need to nourish the outside, particularly if we are going to come together with other people to create things that matter.
Well, yeah, that's a very important topic that we might touch upon at the end. You also you mentioned the community and the team at organizations. Steve Jobs famously said that his greatest legacy was his team at Apple. Was not a product, was not a company, but was the people that he managed to have around him, and that are basically running Apple right now. I want to show, let me see if I can manage to show the audience a picture. Can you see it? Yes.
Yes.
This picture is you seen from the back, another 11 people around a table. And here on the bottom right, there is a person who I believe is Brunello Cuccinelli, talking to you all. And in the background there's a plaque or a stone inscribed by Leonardo himself, I understand. And there's water on the table. I mean, if Leonardo was to paint the Last Supper in modern times, maybe this could be a picture of it. Can you tell us who is in this picture? What is this picture all about?
Yeah, I hope it's not the Last Supper, because I don't remember a betrayal that was coming, after this picture was taken. This is a picture from May 2019, and a very, very special trip that that we organized. It was 12 or 13 technology company CEOs, the most prominent Jeff Bezos. In that picture, you may also recognize Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn, Ned Siegel, the CFO of Twitter, Drew Houston, the founder and CEO of Dropbox. Dick Costolo is there, the former CEO of Twitter. And so there were quite a few really interesting folks who decided to come. And not only did we come to Italy, we went to Solomeo.
Where is Solomeo?
Solomeo is it's just outside of Perugia in Umbria, and it's where Brunello Cuccinelli has created. It's really his wife's childhood home, and it's where he's created his company. And so I'll give you a little bit of context. Why would so many of these great titans of the tech industry, not including myself, but certainly some of the folks that I named, Bezos, Hoffman, Drew Houston, et cetera, why would they come to Solomeo? And what were they trying to learn? Because in that picture, you see that Brunello was speaking to us. And he is not someone who has studied computer science, last I checked. So the story begins with Brunello in Silicon Valley in 2017 or so, where he came over because he was very interested. He'd heard that his clothing was well received in Silicon Valley. And of course, he was very interested in Silicon Valley the way many of us are, because it seems to be where many of these great innovations are coming from. And so he visited, and there was a dinner that was put together. And I was at the dinner along with a number of other Silicon Valley CEOs. The CEO of Instagram is one in particular. I remember the CEO of Salesforce, Mark Benioff, was there as well. And for some of us, when we were invited to the dinner, we thought to ourselves, okay, I've heard of Brunello Cuccinelli. I respect the clothes, the cashmere is incredible, et cetera. But why would I go to a dinner with this guy, particularly, to talk business? Because his industry is so different. Yes, he's been very successful. And we go to the dinner and we realize pretty quickly that Brunello doesn't want to talk at all about cashmere or clothing or anything related to his specific industry. What Brunello wants to talk about is business and a new way of doing business, this kind of humanistic enterprise of doing business. And specifically, this idea that we have a responsibility to give back as stewards of our own companies, but also as guardians of the world at large. And it was a very interesting conversation because Brunello, incredibly well-read, incredibly intelligent, and someone who is very provocative in what he pushes to do and what he's built. And so in the subsequent years, 2018, he came to Silicon Valley. He was actually a keynote speaker at the Salesforce conference, Dreamforce. And we would recreate these dinners that I talked about after the first one at our home in San Francisco. And we would invite these notable CEOs, and it was just a wonderful conversation. And Brunello leaned over to me in 2019 and he said, it was 2018. He said, "This is a great dinner, but my dream is to bring these people to Solomeo and show them our kind of renaissance, our Silicon Valley, our center of genius." And I remember thinking to myself, I might be able to convince some of my friends to go to Rome, Florence, Venice, maybe Milan. Solomeo may be a more difficult sell because it's a little bit in the middle of nowhere, and it doesn't have the same kind of aura as those other cities have. But I went to work, and Bezos had already agreed to come, and so he was kind of centerpiece attraction. And we came over and we spent 3 nights in Solomeo. Brunello was an incredible host. I see one of my friends from Brunello's company, Alberto Andresini, is on the call here, so it's fun for him to hear as well. He's a wonderful example of that great company and someone that I consider a dear friend. And when you go to Solomeo, it feels like you've stepped into this fairy tale. Everyone is happy. Everyone looks creative. Everything is very clean. Things are calm. You feel like you can do your best thinking. It's an incredible combination between modernity in terms of the company that's been built and the way that it operates, and also antiquity, because there's nature and people are doing things fatto a mano with their hands. And I think this was an incredibly inspiring thing for the Silicon Valley CEOs to see for a couple of reasons. One is what Brunello has created there. It feels similar. It feels similar to the way it feels when you visit Apple in Silicon Valley or Facebook or Google. There's an energy. There's an inspiration. There's a kind of current in the air. And I know that many of my great friends in Florence talk about how Florence needs to stop relying on the greatness of 500 years ago and create some of that magic today. Well, Brunello's done it in Solomeo. Brunello has absolutely done it. And I consider that company to be as special as any of those in Silicon Valley in terms of how they treat each other, how they treat their customers, how they treat their partners, how they treat their community. And so it was provocative because it was this incredible oasis in the middle of really nowhere. And how can Brunello bring these talented young people to him versus operate in Milan, operate in Rome, operate in New York, et cetera. The other reason it was really provocative is Brunello had a very, very simple agenda. And that agenda was, okay, Silicon Valley people, you've created these incredible products, these companies, you've amassed unbelievable wealth, in many cases, almost an obscene amount of wealth. What are you going to do to give back? That's sort of at the heart of this humanistic capitalism or this kind of humanistic enterprise that he calls it. It's a responsibility to not just enrich oneself, but to make sure that the blessings are spread, that everyone can benefit from whatever amazing things have been created. And he asked the question, he said, in 500 years, if I visited Silicon Valley, what would be left from your time on this earth, right? We know when we come to Florence, we have the Duomo, we have San Miniato that I talked about, right? We have the David to look at. These are things that are 500 years and older, right? What would you see in Silicon Valley? Will the Apple headquarters, the spaceship thing, will that still be there? Will Google have its many headquarters that are scattered throughout the Bay Area? Will those even exist anymore? Will there be a monument? I mean, at that point, we probably won't be holding phones. Our descendants will have something probably implanted directly in the brain. So what will be the thing that we remember Silicon Valley with? And it was a very, very provocative conversation. At one point, we went to this beautiful theater that Brunello has built. And one by one, we went up on the stage and we talked about the things in our lives that had led us to this point. And we talked about our aspirations for how we were going to make a difference in the world above and beyond the companies that we had created. And this is all Brunello. who brought it together. He's not, as I mentioned, a computer scientist. He's not someone who is even in the tech industry. In fact, I think he would much rather speak to someone in person than send an email or a text message. But like I touched upon earlier, the magic is in the combination of someone like Brunello, who I believe is a Renaissance man for sure, and these extremely modern, progressive captains of industry like Jeff Bezos. The magic is in those two coming together and in trying to together create something that can be better than any of them could create individually. And so it was an absolutely incredible experience. Jeff Bezos actually has a ranch in Texas, and he had said that we would reconvene in Texas. We called this original meeting the Solomeo Summit, and we said we would have the next summit in Texas. And I grew up in Texas. My parents are there, and my brother is there, and I sort of chuckle when I think of Brunello coming to a ranch in the middle of nowhere in Texas. We're going to have to get him some cashmere cowboy boots or something like that. But because of COVID, that's been delayed. But I think it will happen. And I hope that more than the summit, what will happen is we will use this community that we've created together to hold each other accountable, to leave things behind, to build things that can be left behind, that not just our children and their communities can benefit from, but children's 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 children, which is really, in many ways, to me, the legacy of the Renaissance. I mean, the Renaissance was 500 years ago. It is over. It would be nice for Florence and Italy, and frankly, the rest of the world, to have a new Renaissance. But the gifts of the Renaissance continue to bloom today. They continue to add value today. They continue to inspire, to lift people up the way that they did even back then. And I think ultimately, if Silicon Valley wants to take its place alongside the Renaissance as one of these pivotal moments in human history, it needs to figure out, how will we leave things behind that will span not just decades, which, by the way, a decade in Silicon Valley time is an eternity. It's an absolute eternity. Think of all the great companies. You mentioned that I was one of the first employees at Yahoo. When I joined Yahoo in 1996, it was the hottest company on the face of the earth. I used to wear a Yahoo t-shirt and walk down University Avenue in Palo Alto, and I would be mobbed because people loved the company so much. Today, if I had to ask if we were together and I said, raise your hand if you use a Yahoo product today, I would probably hear some crickets chirping, and there wouldn't be many hands going up. That was only 25 years ago. Okay, that's not so long ago, but in Silicon Valley, it's an absolute eternity. So how can Silicon Valley leave behind gifts that will last hundreds of years, not just decades? I think that's a really important question, and frankly, one that Silicon Valley has not answered yet.
Well, one of the gifts is maybe the university that's lasted so long and will last forever, which is really the center of the valley. Now, I think we should touch upon, before going to the Q&A session. Please, by the way, please send your questions on the chat window, and we'll moderate them, or start making yourself raise your hand if you want to pose a question live. We'll get to that after we conclude with Nirav. We have to touch upon, some of the dark side of genius, or all these factors that we mentioned before. Peter Thiel, which is definitely somebody who can be defined as a crazy inventor and creative genius, stated that there is no reason why the future should happen only at Stanford or in the Silicon Valley. And last week, when we were preparing this event, you told me that the Valley's huge success saw the seed of his own decline. And when I go back to the Silicon Valley, I measure the ups and downs of the economy there by the traffic of the 101 and the 280. And you told me that people are leaving the Valley in San Francisco at rates that were never seen before. How has this happened, and where they're going, and where are the next valleys?
Well, let me start by saying that unfortunately, prosperity does not tend to be a very good teacher. Adversity is a much better teacher than prosperity. And so to some extent, if you ask why did the Renaissance not continue for 1,000 years or 2,000 years, or why isn't it still going today? A lot of people say, well, one of the reasons is because Columbus discovered America and there were trade routes that took attention away from this incredible hub that was Renaissance Florence. And that's true. But the other thing is, when you have a lot of success, complacency sets in and you start to protect your position versus continuing to try to move up. And so it's in a very ironic way, it's the need for mobility from the bottom that creates these incredible centers of genius versus you have this amazing place and it just keeps on going forever and ever and ever, right? Complacency sets in, you get fat and happy, as they say, in America. And so one of the things that I thought was so inspiring, frankly, about the Stanford students is that what they really cared about with this class was the dark side of Silicon Valley, why it had occurred, and it seemed to have been occurring recently, meaning call it 2018, 19, 20, and how to prevent that, how to fight against it, and in creating any new centers of genius, how to avoid those same mistakes. Now, what am I talking about when I say the dark side of Silicon Valley? You probably see it now because it's become, sort of this very broad conversation around the world. It could be discrimination. It could be inequality. So with discrimination, I was very lucky. One of my co-founders at Nextdoor is a female. And when I stepped down as CEO, we were very, very fortunate to have a female CEO take over. But there is really no gender diversity in Silicon Valley today. There is very little diversity in terms of the underprivileged races. So we don't see many African Americans. We don't see many Hispanics. These are problems. These are problems. And in an area like Silicon Valley, where we like to think of ourselves as progressives, we cannot talk the talk unless we walk the walk. Inequality is another huge issue in Silicon Valley. If so many people are getting so wealthy, what does that do to the people that can't keep up, either because they don't want to keep up or they have no choice? Isn't it ironic that San Francisco has something like the most billionaires per capita, but also the most homeless people per capita, right? That's a very sort of strange and ironic fact. And so some of these, what I refer to in the class as unintended consequences, these start to crop up when you have this prosperity, and you have to guard against this complacency. You have to constantly be reinventing and constantly be questioning yourself. Otherwise, there are things that set in. Calcification occurs, and then it can lead to some bad outcomes. We're seeing now if the valley can endure, because many of those things that have come together have created the opportunity. And really, with COVID coming and helping people realize that knowledge workers in Silicon Valley can do their jobs no matter where they are, as long as they have a high-speed connection and a computer. Many people don't want to be in Silicon Valley anymore. It's too expensive to live there. It's too much of a rat race. They don't like the attitudes. They don't like the inequality. It's not a great place to raise children. And I had sent you, Stefano, an article in the Mercury News, which is the San Jose newspaper, that talked about how San Francisco in particular seems to be experiencing a fairly significant exodus. People are moving out of San Francisco and they don't want to live there anymore. And again, it's very, very ironic that this is happening, because San Francisco is the center of so much incredible innovation. And it's where so many of the big companies are. And it's still where, when you graduate from college, you'd love to be in San Francisco because you feel that energy. But I think there are a couple of interesting trends that are occurring right now that we have to pay attention to as we think about the durability of Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley proper, I would say, has been around for probably 120 or 130 years. So it cannot take its place alongside Renaissance Florence if it is only 120 years. And if it doesn't leave things behind, as I said earlier. So what are those three trends? And then we'll get to the Q&A. Well, one trend is there is a disillusionment going on in Silicon Valley. And it's because of some of the things I mentioned, the lack of equality, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's gender, whether it's race. And that is something that doesn't make people feel like they're coming to a place to change the world. It makes people feel like they're coming to a place to make money. And while making money is a very, very strong motivation, I don't think it's the motivation that ultimately leads creatives to do amazing things. And it's very difficult for it to bring teams together because making money tends to be an individualized pursuit. So that's one interesting trend, the disillusionment with some of these principles that we felt like made Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley. The second thing is with COVID, we now have this world of virtualization. It's again, this kind of delicious irony, right? That we said to ourselves, gosh, with COVID, I'm now able to understand that I need to live in the moment and I need to embrace my family. And I was so busy before and I was out of the house and I wasn't taking advantage of the most important people and relationships that I had. But the way that we are staying connected to those outside the house is technology, right? So we, in some ways, have let go of the shackles of technology, but in some ways, we've actually grown even more tangled in them. And it will be quite interesting to understand this virtualization and what impact it has on geography, physical place, because we made a very strong argument in our course that physical place was a critical ingredient in creating a kind of gathering place for this center of genius to be created. So I don't know where this is going to end because, as an example, at Nextdoor, we made the decision over a year ago to shut down the offices, and there is no plan to reopen them, certainly not till the end of this year, right? And I think that in employee surveys, something like 40% of the employees never want to come back, right? So like, how's that going to work itself out, right? There are a number of very big Silicon Valley companies, Salesforce, Twitter, Square, who have said, we are no longer a headquarters-based company. We are virtual first. Dropbox has said the same thing, right? So that's quite interesting. And then the third trend, and we talk about this in the class, is what's happening in China. Is there a new Silicon Valley, a new center of genius is a better way of describing it, occurring in China? I thought something very interesting happened over the last year, which is for the first time, really a Chinese-based company, TikTok, is the new darling worldwide when it comes to social media. So if you think about these huge brands that are worldwide, most of them have been created in America. You have Spotify from Sweden, but most of them, Facebook, Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, they're US-based companies, right? And then they go worldwide. China is so large that it's almost its own world. And so there are a number of alternatives to those services that I just mentioned that only operate in China. But now TikTok comes along, and it is a company that is a Chinese company, but the whole world is using it. So what does that mean? Can this happen? Can Silicon Valley be replaced by China as the place where the most innovative ideas and companies are emanating? And they not only then take root in China, they take root worldwide. I think these are three very interesting trends to watch.
Do you think, a follow-up question on what you just mentioned, there's so many interesting topics, and I guess we'll touch upon a few of them in the Q&A session, but do you think that there will be multiple and geographically dispersed center of geniuses because of this new way of organizing work and virtual organizations that finally, because of necessity, has happened?
Yeah, I think that one of the hypotheses that's being played out right now in terms of the exodus from Silicon Valley and the ability to work virtually in general is, let's recreate enough of a critical mass in multiple places. Austin, Texas, Seattle, Washington. It could be, I've heard
Solomeo.
Yeah, it could be Solomeo. It could be Milan. I've heard that there's a very vibrant startup scene in the Veneto right now. Certainly Berlin in Germany is experiencing, as well as London, some real kinds of renaissance when it comes to tech startups. But I think the question is, when you take those innovative people and ideas and communities and you fragment them, if you added them all back up together, would you get the sum of one place that's compounding on itself? I think in general, that's very, very difficult to pull off. In general, when you fragment something, the sum of the parts don't add up to that one whole that was held together, right? But we will see. I mean, I think that's going to be one of the really interesting things to watch over the next decade.
Okay, thank you, Nirav. For now, let's open the floor to questions. I see one hand raised. Federico, do you want to maybe first summarize some of the questions that you saw through the chat?
Sure. There's a couple of interesting questions that came through the floor. So let me raise one. So someone is asking, you know, regarding creating Silicon Valley, what are we missing in Europe? Why can't we attract the talented people in Italy, or I would say Europe in general? You mentioned, you know, how, you know, most of the stuff gets created in the US, and we're seeing China, but Europe is really lacking in terms of innovation, right? And just your thoughts on this.
It's interesting because I would say Europe is lacking maybe relative to Silicon Valley, but relative to the rest of the world, Europe actually has, you know, a lot of interesting things happening. Really, innovation, China, India, those guys are actually above and beyond even Silicon Valley to some extent. And then you've got Silicon Valley, obviously, and then you've got Europe. And then, you know, why don't we think about some of the third world countries that are in even worse shape? The simple answer is, you have to bring together all of the factors, not just a few of them, for lightning to strike. And so, not talking about Europe in particular, but speaking sort of more generally, why are there not more Silicon Valleys? It's because in many places you have one or two of the factors. You don't have all of them, and you don't have all of them in a continuous enough fashion that the flywheel can get started. And so the flywheel's moving maybe a little bit, but it never picks up that momentum that makes it self-fulfilling, that gives it sort of increasing returns to scale. And so I have been quite interested why governments haven't wanted to study this more deeply and say, look, we don't know if these 5 factors that I've mentioned are the ones or whether there are 20 of them, but let's find a place and let's put all 20 of them in. Right? And maybe we will happen upon the recipe, right? Because if you don't do it, then what ultimately happens is the best and brightest people, they go to Silicon Valley. They go to wherever the center of genius is, because it's like a sun that's pulling things to it. It has this kind of attraction. And so I think you have to create that kind of core attraction. And if you don't, it's difficult to have any chance.
Okay. Then somebody is asking, you know, once COVID is over, you know, can we bring more people over from Silicon Valley to try and inspire them regarding this 500-year mindset? Is that, you think, something feasible?
I mean, I hope so. Linda and I saw my other colleague from Stanford and Florence, Fosca, on the call as well. I mean, they know that, I mean, the 3 of us and several other colleagues of theirs, Alessio and Giovanni, we worked tirelessly to try to bring Silicon Valley people over, and we were successful. We had, you know, probably 6 amazing people come, and we did sessions. I used to joke with them and say, you know, it surprises me that when we bring one of these luminaries to Florence and we have them do a talk, we are scratching and biting and clawing to get 100 people to come to one of these sessions. And these are people who don't even do these kinds of sessions in Silicon Valley. If they did, there would be 1,000 people that would show up, right? And so part of it is there's got to be a connection. It's not just the Silicon Valley people coming over, it's the people of Florence wanting to reach up and sort of rise above where they are today. Look, Florence is so gorgeous. I look around, even the room I'm in, I can see outside and see amazing architecture. I understand why complacency sets in. I mean, you sort of admire so much where you are that you don't think you need to do more. But if you don't come to something thinking that you need to do more, you'll never move the needle. And so I think that it needs to be a connection between folks who have a Silicon Valley mindset, whether they're in Silicon Valley or other places, as well as the people in Italy, right? The people in Italy need to say, okay, we have a rich history. We have an unbelievable tradition. We have so many gifts that we've given to humankind. Now let's do it again. Let's get the energy up to do it again. Let's get everyone in on this. Remember when COVID first hit, and there was this incredibly beautiful response by the Italian people, and they were unified and they were together and they said, it's going to be okay, right? That was a very, very interesting moment for me, because I thought to myself, once this is all over, if the Italians can recapture this spirit of coming together and wanting to collectively build something great, that's an opportunity for the country, for sure.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I see Lucia has raised her hand. Do you want to make your question, Lucia?
Yes, thank you so much. I completely agree with what you're saying. I'm from San Francisco, born and raised, started my career in Silicon Valley, and I've been working in the startup culture here in Rome and in Italy for the last 6 years. So I'm just loving this discussion. Thank you so much. I would just continue. I would like to ask what you think, because there's so much value that Italy and the Italian culture can offer to the leadership in Silicon Valley right now, and especially in terms of the connection to place, as you were talking about. So my question is, what do you think could be ways to inspire Silicon Valley to have a stronger connection with the land? I mean, California has an incredible landscape like Italy does. There's a lot of environmental problems right now with fires, for example. There's abandoned offices. So what do you think about Italians consulting with the leaders in Silicon Valley to how to connect with the local places and perhaps invest 20% of their people's time when they go back to the office to creating a more environmentally friendly place, a more sensually enjoyable place to be? So I'd love your thoughts on that, how that might happen.
Yeah, I would say two things. The first is Silicon Valley has become so wedded to the currency of the stock option with these companies. And you have this goal of going public. And once you go public, it's incredibly hard. You said 20%. I mean, can you imagine the shareholders out there voting to give 20% of profits or 20% of revenue or 20% of anything towards a cause that is not directly related to the benefit of the company, right? It's very, very difficult. And so I have so much admiration for folks like Mark Benioff. He started this 1%, 1% foundation, 1% of profits, 1% of equity, 1% of time gets donated, right? And yet big companies, they don't really want to follow suit. They want to do it their own way. It's a very sort of Silicon Valley mindset. I mean, Apple does a lot, but they do it their own way. And so I sometimes feel that as a young startup, you're looking at these companies, you want to emulate them. If there were a way to bring the companies together with a common goal, that to me would feel so much more powerful, create a kind of community around making change. But today, Apple doesn't talk to Facebook, and Facebook doesn't really talk to Snapchat. Snapchat doesn't talk to Twitter, and Twitter doesn't talk to Google, and ... right down the line, right? Because they are still businesses that are highly competitive. I mean, the battle for talent is intense in California. It is absolutely intense, right? And so these partnerships tend to be partnerships of convenience, not partnerships of aspiration, unfortunately. But I don't think that means we can stop trying. I think we should continue. And ultimately, I believe it has to come from the employee bases. The people at the top should do what their most valued asset, which is their talent base, demands that they do. And so if the rank and file start to say, look, I'm okay with giving 20% of the value, that's a huge number. I'm okay giving 20% of the value that you're paying me and giving it to someone else, giving it to something else, giving it to a cause, right? That'll start to break through. In reality, 2% would be a great start. 1% would be a great start, right? So that's one side. The other side is, I'll maybe start to close in one of the places where we started, which is the reason it was such an incredible privilege to work with Stanford students is because I have a very strong belief that the most fertile people to inspire to do great things are students, because they haven't started yet. They don't have mortgages that they need to pay. They don't have mouths that they need to feed. They are in the position where they are determining, okay, what will my path be? And imagine Stanford students. I mean, I was telling Stefano this. I mean, when I was at Stanford, you know, now I entered over 30 years ago, 1990, I entered as an undergrad, right? I'm sure it's 100 times harder to get into the university today. And so the quality of student is 100 times greater. I mean, these truly are the next Leonardos, the next Michelangelos, the next Steve Jobs, Elon Musk's. There's no doubt that folks from those classes, and really universities from around the world, whether it's Bocconi or really University of Florence, it can be any place. It's the students that will become the geniuses of tomorrow. And so to me, it's really about inspiring them and making sure that, you know, whether we are running companies and they're looking up to us, whether we have the opportunity to lecture at universities, to do Zooms like this, to teach a class, or even to go to folks like Linda and Fosca and others and just thank them for the job they're doing. I mean, we're all here today because of Stanford, right? Stanford is the organizing sort of community tentpole that this talk is around. And it's because Stanford is all about sharing knowledge. It's all about, I mean, the institution of learning, right? And so to me, this extremely pivotal time in a human's life, being in college, you're enough of an adult to start to formulate your own ideas, your own values, your own goals, but you're young enough that you're not tied down by responsibilities, right? And so I think that's a very critical place for us to make sure that we are increasing, frankly, the amount of responsibility to some extent that we try to inspire these students with. And probably, you know, the most inspirational thing for me was hearing these students talk about how badly they wanted to be part of Silicon Valley, but not the Silicon Valley that was starting to get people disillusioned, but the Silicon Valley that was good, that was helping people, that was giving back, as you say, right? That's the future. That's the future, not just of Silicon Valley, but of civilization for all of us.
Well, thank you so much, Nirav. I think I shared the view with the rest of the audience that the session was incredibly interesting and possibly too short. I want to leave you with one of the comments I read in the chat. Said, Nirav, please do some version of the class virtually online. There are lots of platforms. I will be one of your students. You are very interesting and engaging.
You need to ask Linda Campani. She's the owner. She and Stanford are the owner of all of this intellectual property.
I'm sure. I really hope the program in Florence will start as soon as possible again, and then we are off this pandemic and we can come live to hear it from you somewhere in Florence or near Florence in Solomeo. Thank you so much, Nirav. Thank you all for attending, and see you all in the next event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao Stefano, grazie.
Grazie, Nirav.